Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5503, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Authorization Act of 2018. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5503 to authorize the programs of the National Aeronautics and Space Administrations for fiscal years 2018 and 2019 and for other purposes.
With that objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. The NASA Authorization Act of 2018 is a crucial step in continuing the greatness of American space exploration. The Act ensures that NASA will focus on its priority missions, leverage private sector partnerships and entrepreneurship, and continue space research that will launch America toward new scientific discoveries and worlds. NASA's funding amounts to $20.74 billion, or 0.5% of the federal budget. Consistent with the core policy tenets of the President's budget request, the 2018 NASA Authorization Act maintains a balanced portfolio across a broad array of NASA priority programs and initiatives. It funds deep space exploration systems above the President's request to expedite the Space Launch System and Orion spacecraft. It funds science above the President's budget request to allow NASA to move forward with a number of programs, including a Mars sample return mission and Europa exploration. The committee has ongoing concerns that NASA has been given responsibility for Earth science activities that compete for funding with NASA's core functions in space exploration and aeronautics. A good example is Landsat. In the past, both United States Geological Survey and NOAA have been responsible for development and operation of Landsat satellites. But now NASA is responsible for mission and development activities, including Landsat 9, along with an activity to design and build a full capability Landsat 10 satellite. In the Omnibus Appropriations Bill, 11 of the 12 other agencies conducting Earth science research received budget increases, such as NOAA, DOE, United States Geological Survey, Agriculture, EPA, NSF, the Smithsonian, DOT, HHS, DOD, and even the United States Agency for International Development. However, NASA has, for too long, conducted Earth science work for the benefit of other agencies without reimbursement. To make certain NASA's funding authorization is truly focused on space exploration and aeronautics, this act aligns funding accordingly and directs reimbursement to NASA for Earth science work undertaken for the benefit of other agencies. This reimbursement directive serves to offset NASA funding reductions in Earth science relative to the President's budget request. However, Earth science still receives $1.45 billion, or 7% of NASA's entire budget. The Act supports the President's proposal to restructure and increase funding for NASA space technology programs to better align to NASA human and robotic exploration needs. This is a good step forward for NASA. As a critical component to NASA's exploration agenda, for too long, space technology investments lack the focus and attention they deserve. The Act includes a number of provisions increasing transparency into NASA's management of major programs and ensuring that contractors are held responsible for poor performance. Just 3 weeks ago, Congress was notified that the James Webb Space Telescope is delayed yet again. In fact, it has been delayed no less than 3 times, originally scheduled for launch in 2007, then 2014, then 2018, and now for 2020. And the cost has increased from $1 billion to $8 billion. While this committee supports JWST, NASA and its contractors must be held accountable. The committee looks forward to the Independent Review Board's report this summer, which will determine the revised cost estimate for the program and help define a way forward for the Space Telescope program. That brings me to the Wide Field Infrared Space Telescope, WFIRST. This committee has consistently supported it, but the recent cost growth and independent review team findings are similar to problems incurred on JWST. The Act strikes a balance, capping spending if WFIRST moves forward and providing a set-aside in fiscal year 19 of $180 million to address justified recommendations of the JWST and WFIRST program reviews that are pending. We have explored near-Earth object defense at committee hearings. The administration prioritized this mission and requested $150 million for NASA's planetary defense program. NASA must complete its NEO survey. Supporting projects such as the NEOCAM mission could go a long way to accomplishing this task. Testimony before this committee has also highlighted that we are on the verge of a breakthrough in the search for life that could change the way humanity views its place in the universe. In the 2017 NASA Transition Authorization Act, NASA was given a new statutory directive for NASA to, quote, search for life's origin, evolution, distribution, and future in the universe, end quote. This act directs and authorizes funds to achieve that purpose. It was my hope that today we would have a bipartisan markup. In fact, discussions have been ongoing for weeks, and a draft bill text was exchanged 3 weeks ago. An offer was made and rejected to fund earth science that the NASA requested at omnibus levels, though I expect that to continue to be discussed shortly. The U.S. has led the world in space exploration for 50 years, and we must ensure that the U.S. continues to do so for the next 50 years. We must also continue to invest in NASA as the only American agency responsible for space exploration. I want to thank Chairman Babin for introducing this bill. It redoubles our commitment to U.S. leadership in space for decades to come. I'll now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, for her opening statement. Oh, and before I close, I'd like to add one more thing. Excuse me, Ms. Johnson. I want to thank the committee staff who devoted so much time and effort for months, including this past weekend. I know we were all there on Sunday, for example, and Saturday, to negotiate a perfect bill. They are Mike Monero, Ryan Faith, Sam Amber, Sarah Ratcliffe, Molly Fromm, Tom Conley, and the recently departed for active naval duty, Tom Hammond, as well as Chairman Babin's staff, Steve Januskowski. Thank you all for the long time effort, for the many hours, and for working over this last weekend. I strongly support the bill and urge my colleagues to support it as well. And that concludes my opening statement. The ranking member is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Unlike the last bill we considered, this bill, H.R. 5503, is deeply flawed, and the process that got us to this moment was just as flawed, as I will explain. First, this bill slashes funding for earth science by $500 million in fiscal year 19, a quarter of the total earth science budget. These cuts are simply another manifestation of the majority's continued war on climate science. However, these reckless cuts are so deep that they will likely threaten more than just climate science at NASA. The earth science budget supports numerous programs that help Americans, from aiding farmers to saving American lives in natural disaster response. And all of us must know what natural disaster has been like recently. Where does all this money go? The majority diverts it to searching for space aliens and to the president's unexamined initiative to build an orbiting moon base, among other things. I really wish this was a joke. The majority slashes funding from programs that help humans here on Earth and instead prioritizes spending money to find space aliens. Let me be clear. I think the search for life in the universe is a fascinating quest. And I'm also a strong supporter of exploration. But I think melting ice caps, rising sea levels, the increases in extreme weather events and drought, and the other serious manifestations of climate change here on Earth are also things we should be concerned about and studying. I don't have time today to discuss all the issues with this bill because there really are many. I would just note that the bill endorses President Trump's exploration priorities and plans without the committee having had a single hearing to review it. It directs NASA to follow the ISS transition plan before committee members have even had any opportunity to review it in depth or hear from stakeholders. I could go on with other examples, but I think you get the point. As problematic as the substance of this bill is, the process that brought us here today is just as problematic. The majority staff began discussing this legislation with minority a couple of weeks ago. They first provided minority staff with an early draft 2 weeks ago. A significantly different version was provided to the minority on April the 12th. It came with an ultimatum. In essence, if I didn't agree to support the bill as written, then the chairman would notice the markup on April the 13th with a very different punitive version of the bill. And that's what's happened, just as members were leaving town for the weekend. I really don't think vindictiveness is a good basis for legislating. I also don't think it is very effective in the long run. I don't think it is very effective, especially for professionals that have the confidence of the public to look out for their common good. But the reality is we are now marking up a partisan bill that has been rushed to markup with childish ultimatums and arbitrary deadlines in the process, disenfranchising members on both sides of the aisle from being able to conduct the oversight and hearings that one of our committee's most significant agencies warrant. There's no way to legislate for an agency that accounts for fully 1/2 of the total dollars of our committee authorizes. It has needlessly injected partisanship in our nation's space program yet again. That doesn't help NASA, nor does it help us. Instead, it ultimately winds up weakening the widespread bipartisan support NASA has traditionally enjoyed, and it certainly diminishes the standing of this committee. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'm going to recognize myself for a minute to respond, and so that all members know at least how I see the process. For several weeks, going back to mid-March, long before a draft bill was complete, my staff have been in discussion with their minority counterparts regarding the NASA authorization and markup. Text was formally transmitted to minority staff on Monday, April 2. On April 3 and April 4, 2 weeks ago, majority staff met with their minority counterparts for more than 5 hours to walk through the bill and answer questions. Indeed, several suggestions made during these discussions with minority staff were incorporated into the bill. Originally, this markup was scheduled for April 12th, and majority and minority staff were working towards this date. The decision was made to postpone the markup to today, April 17th, in order to allow staff more time to work on the bill at the minority's request. On April 11th, a formal offer was made for a bipartisan bill with higher levels for the earth science account. On April 12th, the most up-to-date version to the policy provisions of the bill were transmitted to minority staff literally within seconds after we received it. Majority staff offered to discuss the bill and the offer at the minority's convenience. The offer was never accepted. Majority staff, in my view, has acted in good faith and been in discussions of the bill with the minority on a regular basis for weeks. I will now recognize the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the Space Subcommittee, Mr. Brian Babin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor and a privilege to bring the NASA 2018 authorization to this committee today. Just over a year ago, the 2017 NASA Transition Authorization Act was signed into law, representing a clear bipartisan commitment to our nation's space program. That law established, and this bill continues to honor, 3 very important provisions: continuity of purpose, clear long-term goals for exploration, and a balanced space science portfolio. NASA must stay the course on future exploration while preserving our advancements in low Earth orbit. The first urgent question is the future of the International Space Station. The ISS is the jewel and the crown of America's space program. As a representative of the hardworking men and women of Johnson Space Center, I know how important the ISS is to our nation. The administration, in response to congressional direction in 2017, has provided a proposal for ISS transition. It is too early to say how or when the transition will occur, but the recent report outlines a credible course of action and early initial steps. I support the administration carrying out these first steps, but it is critically important that we see a more detailed plan before steps are taken to sunset the ISS. The bill directs NASA to continue the operation of the ISS for such time as Congress authorizes. It prevents the administration from pursuing any international agreements that would tie the hands of future Congresses. The administrator must report directly to this committee every 3 months on the status of the ISS transition. In other words, the ISS must be transitioned, but not before we, as a nation, are ready to do so. This bill provides funding for the SLS and Orion programs at omnibus levels. signaling that we will support the programs as they move towards realization. It also explicitly authorizes and directs development of a second mobile launch platform to increase safety, reduce delays, and provide flexibility for exploration. These and other measures provide a strong foundation, fostering a whole of government, indeed a whole of nation approach to space. As Vice President Pence said yesterday, space exploration is essential to our national security. It's essential to our nation's prosperity, and it is essential to the very character of America. I have and continue to support the idea of a balanced space program. We must also understand that balanced means not only balanced within NASA, but also balanced across government. Within the proposed authorization levels, NASA's science portfolio is 30% of NASA's budget. This is consistent with both the omnibus and the President's budget request. In planetary science, this bill increases spending for the kind of science that only NASA can do, and for which NASA is the first and perhaps the only customer, such as Mars sample return and missions to Europa. In a responsible way, Earth science is correspondingly reduced. The administration is directed to provide NASA reimbursement for work undertaken for the benefit of other agencies, such as the development of particular Earth science systems. This will allow NASA continuing working on missions like Landsat without undermining its exploration mission. NASA fills an essential and irreplaceable role for our country. It is the only agency to send humans to the surface of another celestial body, to send spacecraft to every planet in the solar system, and to send probes into interstellar space. I want to thank Chairman Smith for his leadership and guidance in reaffirming our national commitment to the exploration and use of space. I strongly recommend this bill and urge my colleagues to actively support it. And before I yield back to the chairman, without an objection, I'd like to place the following letters and statements of support in the record from a number of organizations, including the Aerospace Industries Association, American Society for Gravitational and Space Research, Association of Universities for Research in Astronomy, Astrobotic, Bay Area Houston Economic Partnership, Boeing, Commercial Spaceflight Federation, Made in Space, Moon Express, NanoRacks, National Space Grant Alliance, Texas A&M University System, Vector Space Systems, Virginia Commercial Spaceflight Authority, and Space Florida. I request to enter these 15 letters and statements into the record without objection.
Without objection, that list of individual organizations, companies, and stakeholders who endorse the bill will be made a part of the record.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. The gentleman from California, the ranking member of the Space Subcommittee, Mr. Baer, is recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The importance of our investments in NASA and its ability to inspire can't be underestimated. I often talk about my childhood and vivid recollections of the space program and the influence that NASA and the Apollo program had in my pursuit of science and medicine. NASA's work also helps us attract the best and brightest to go into STEM disciplines and contributes to a world-class workforce. Our workforce not only makes NASA's scientific discoveries possible, but it powers an engine of innovation and economic strength for our country through its advances in human exploration, aeronautics, and space technology. Mr. Chairman, one of the things that I've enjoyed most about working with the ranking subcommittee chairman, Mr. Babin, is how bipartisan and collaborative our hearings have been. Whether we're talking about deep space exploration, the discovery of planets in the habitable zone, looking for life out there. But what bothers me and what has me concerned about today's NASA authorization bill under consideration is that both I and my colleagues received this bill on Friday. With fiscal year 2018 appropriations of $20.7 billion, NASA is the largest agency under the jurisdiction of this committee. While I understand the majority and minority staff were communicating on a discussion draft of the bill, Democratic staff did not receive proposed funding numbers and a finalized bill text until late last week. Mr. Chairman, we both share the goal of sustaining a strong NASA that is funded sufficiently to complete the tasks the nation has asked of it. However, I have concerns about how a rushed markup process can help us reach that goal together. Our colleagues just returned to Washington last night, leaving little time to fully consider the bill and the funding and policy direction it would give to NASA. Moreover, I remain worried about potential implications of a rushed markup on that important policy issues regarding our space program, especially in light of NASA's need to reassess program and spending plans following the recently enacted FY18 omnibus. Turning to the content of the bill, the proposed $470 million cut to Earth Sciences for FY19 is deeply concerning when NASA's Earth science data played a key role in informing our response to a number of natural disasters that wreaked havoc this past year. At the same time, the bill proposes increasing the planetary science account by more than $400 million above FY18 appropriated levels without any basis or policy guidance on how the increase is to be spent. In addition, the Astrophysics Decadal Survey's top-ranked W1st mission that we discussed during our NASA FY19 budget hearing and its potential to return transformational science is called into question in this bill. The role of NASA's space technology program, including important initiatives on satellite servicing and its potential applications for industry, also could be shortchanged. Further, policy would be set on the International Space Station transition without the opportunity of our committee to review NASA's recently submitted transition plan as required by last year's NASA Transitional Authorization Act. The future of ISS is a major policy issue and one that deserves the committee's oversight. Mr. Chairman, this committee's policy and direction for NASA will be felt in the next generation of stargazers, space explorers, business leaders, scientists, and engineers. Before we legislate, we have an obligation to take the time to hold the hearings, gather the necessary information, consider the views of stakeholders, and weigh the decisions that will help sustain a strong and stable future for NASA. With that, I look forward to working with you to that end and having those hearings. Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Barron. Let me respond to a couple of your points. And the first is to reassure you and other members of the committee that between now and the House floor, we will continue to have discussions on policies, and those discussions will be in good faith. I realize that the minority has not had as much time as they would have liked. On the other hand, we have complied with all requirements, legislative and otherwise, and while I regret that staff has to work on weekends, I sometimes think that that simply has to be done, and I know the majority of staff did work over the weekend as well. So I'm hoping we can go forward with a good faith bipartisan effort that after the Perlmutter amendment will allow all members to support the bill. And to that end, let me say that we are going to take up the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the manager's amendment by Mr. Babin first, after which we will go to Mr. Perlmutter's amendment. Let's see, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, is recognized to offer the manager's amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does a gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
I do have an amendment at the desk.
Okay, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Babin of Texas, amendment number 001.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his manager's amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment represents a good faith effort to incorporate constructive feedback received from stakeholders after the introduction of the bill. It also contains technical corrections. This amendment emphasizes the President's goal to lead the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization, followed by human missions to Mars and other destinations. Furthermore, this amendment makes it clear that NASA shall pursue the expeditious development of a new bill's second mobile launch platform, and NASA shall also procure a second interim cryogenic propulsion stage. Finally, this amendment encourages NASA to leverage state government infrastructure investments and also requires a report by NASA on procurement opportunities of commercial in-space services or infrastructure for exploration. I support this amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Let me respond real quickly and say that I thank him for this amendment. The manager's amendment makes technical and conforming changes to the bill and also makes changes that resulted from member and stakeholder feedback. The amendment improves the bill, and I thank, again, the chairman of the Space Subcommittee for his good work on this. And the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm reluctantly going to have to oppose the gentleman's amendment in its current form. I appreciate the fact that the amendment fixes some of the problems with the bill that resulted from the rush to mark up the bill that clearly is not ready for markup. Reversing the funding incorrectly allocated to the two main exploration projects, SLS and Orion, is an obvious example. The amendment also gets rid of problematic commercialization language that had not been adequately vetted. If the changes had been confined to those items and to the technical corrections that are included, I probably could support this amendment. Unfortunately, the amendment also adds additional provisions, another indication of a bill that was brought to markup before it was ready, and some of these provisions are problematic or premature. These range from endorsing the president's exploration priorities without even having seen the long overdue exploration roadmap this committee asked for in 2017 Transition Act, apparently imposing an unfunded mandate on NASA to develop a second ICPS and requiring a wasteful and unnecessary GAO report. In sum, the gentleman's amendment makes some useful corrections, but it also includes additional provisions that need more scrutiny. I hope that the gentleman would consider withdrawing this amendment to allow time to address these issues. I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, the question is on agreeing to the manager amendment offered by Mr. Babin. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment is going to be an amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, number 28.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado, amendment number 028.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Okay, without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain the amendment.
The amendment is sort of at the heart of some of the concerns that we have concerning the bill, and I appreciate the chairman's agreement to continue allow negotiations by all of us as the overall bill moves forward. The amendment that I have proposed, Amendment 28, is to restore $471 million, which was a 25% cut from the fiscal year 18 budget for earth sciences. So the purpose is to restore that cut. I want to remind everyone what earth sciences, what this line item really is. It is to develop a scientific understanding of the Earth system and its response to natural or human-induced changes, and to improve prediction of climate, weather, and natural hazards, both for personal safety as well as commerce. All we're trying to do is have the best data we can gather about the Earth's oceans, surface, and atmosphere, and try to understand our planet to the best of our ability. That understanding will improve weather forecasts and has a tremendous impact on the safety of our constituents and the flow of commerce across the world. I was pleased to see language in this bill which acknowledges the work of the recently released Earth Sciences Decadal Survey. Included in this survey was a wealth of information on the importance of earth science data and how we use this data in our daily lives. The Decadal Survey acknowledged the tight budget environment facing earth science research, and they made some tough decisions in putting together that document. But the fact is that even under current funding, there's about a third less than what is necessary. Cuts like is initially proposed in the bill of 25% only exacerbate the problem and undercut the Earth Science Decadal Survey that the bill actually endorses. So I urge my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, to support the amendment to restore the $471 million cut to earth sciences so that we can have the equipment and the services that are necessary for us to understand how all of this fits together, whether it's through weather satellites or just the continued observations that we make through the NASA line item budget. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. Let me recognize myself in support of the amendment and say at the outset I appreciate his initiative in drafting this amendment and offering it now. I also appreciate the support of the ranking member and Mr. Barra, the ranking member of the Space Subcommittee. This was not an easy amendment for the majority to swallow, and I think you all know that. But we are going forward in good faith with majority support because we want to genuinely and hopefully increase the prospects of this NASA bill going forward on the floor and beyond that. So I recognize this amendment represents a compromise. I hope there will be strong support on both sides to show good faith for the process, which includes bipartisanship discussions as well as an effort to try to do the best we can for NASA. So again, thank you for the amendment. And is there anyone else who wishes to be recognized on this amendment? Does the ranking member want to be recognized?
I support the amendment, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Barra?
I support the amendment as well.
Okay. Anyone else want to speak any longer on the amendment?
I'm happy to talk some more.
Okay.
Texas needs
And I think we're fine over here. All right. Let's see, without any further discussion on the amendment, the question is on agreeing to Mr. Perlmutter's amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The amendment is agreed to, and we will now, the gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Could we have a record vote?
Recorded vote has been requested, and as mentioned earlier, the recorded votes will be postponed. Up next is, we'll now go back to regular order on the list of amendments, and the next one is going to be offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Posey of Florida, amendment number 049.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following the public disclosure of security and export control violations at its research centers, the administration contracted with the National Academy of Public Administration to conduct an independent assessment of how the administration carried out foreign national access management practices and other security matters. The assessment by the National Academy of Public Administration concluded that NASA networks are compromised, and the administration lacked a standardized and systematic approach to export compliance, and that individuals within the administration were not held accountable when making serious preventable errors in carrying out foreign national access management processes and other security matters. This amendment simply requires the administration to report to the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology of the House of Representatives and the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation over in the Senate on how it plans to address each of the recommendations made in the security assessment by the National Academy of Public Administration regarding security and safeguarding export control information. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Posey, for your amendment, and I support it. It will ensure that the information technology security recommendations from the National Academy of Public Administration on foreign national access management are, in fact, implemented. And I encourage members to support the amendment. Is there anyone else who wishes to be recognized on the amendment? If not, the question is on agreeing to the Posey amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We will now go to an amendment to be offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dunn, and he is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Babin of the subcommittee, ranking members Johnson and Amy Barra.
And the gentleman has an amendment at the desk, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Dunn of Florida, amendment number 041.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman continues to be recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is an exciting day for the members of the committee. We have the opportunity to help shape the authorities and funding of NASA and its partners that they'll use to advance space exploration and science. With that objective in mind, I'm offering Amendment 41. State and local governments have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in new space-related infrastructure that benefits federal civil programs, national security programs and missions, as well as the commercial space industry. This amendment proposes a report that describes those investments and partnerships that have benefited the federal, commercial, and state users. It also requires reporting on the prospective or burgeoning opportunities for federal, state matching grant funding to support shared infrastructure, as well as how these partnerships can be expanded to better serve civil, national security, and commercial space missions. And I ask that the committee support this amendment to H.R. 5503. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn, and I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment, which creates a lasting partnership between NASA and state and local governments. In a limited budget environment, we must make difficult choices about how to fund federal programs. The ability to leverage the strengths and expertise of state and local governments will help to maintain American space leadership now and in the future. So I thank Mr. Dunn for offering this amendment. I urge my colleagues to support it. If there's no further discussion, all in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Next up is an amendment to be offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman.
And the gentleman has an amendment at the desk.
I have an amendment.
And without objection, the amendment is, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Rohrabacher of California, amendment number 025.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from California is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When I first arrived here a number of years ago, I was told that the House and the Senate have one thing in common with both the House and the Senate, and that is that we both have 100 members who are total idiots. And let me just say that what we have been witnessing with the prevention of an administrator for NASA for over 15 months is a disgrace. It's a disgrace for not just the Senate, not just the House, for Congress in general. Congress is not doing its job in a number of areas. I think it underscores that we do need some fundamental reform of our process, both Senate and House side. But today, we realize that the Senate, on something that could very easily be done, and that is a confirmation of a NASA administrator, and we have a colleague who we all know, who's bright, he's creative, could be doing a fantastic job for our country through as being the administrator of NASA. He's been held up by the United States Senate. And we need, now let me just note that Robert Lightfoot, as acting administrator of NASA, has done a terrific job. We've all had a chance to talk with him and work with him. So my hat's off to him, but it is disgraceful that we have not actually put in place an administrator, permanent administrator. So my amendment states, it's getting tough, no appropriation shall be authorized to NASA until a NASA administrator nominee is confirmed by the United States Senate. That's simple as that. And if the Senate doesn't think that it's important enough to vote on a NASA administrator, maybe they don't think it's important for us to fund NASA. And that's that. I certainly would.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I agree with you 100% that Mr. Bridenstine ought to be confirmed by the Senate, and this delay is really unconscionable because the agency needs leadership. Mr. Lightfoot was fantastic. He's now stepped down. But ask my friend, do you really need the sledgehammer at this point about no funding for NASA? That would be my
Well,
question.
if the chairman would ask me to put my big hammer down and lay it aside for a little while, I guess I'd be willing to acquiesce to our fine chairman.
Does the gentleman wish to withdraw the amendment?
I withdraw my amendment.
Okay, without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. But you sure got Mr. Perlmutter's attention, which was worth doing. The gentleman from California has another amendment. He's recognized for the purposes of offering that. The clerk will report the amendment. This is Rohrabacher, Second Amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Rohrabacher of California, amendment number 026.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain the amendment.
I have quite often mentioned that there is a major threat looming that we have not dealt with, and that we should make sure that we spend more time making sure that the whole job we're trying to do in space cannot be destroyed by space debris. And I believe space debris is a very serious challenge. It's actually, I believe, as we move on, space debris is going to be as great a challenge in getting things done in space as are the technical end of what we're trying to accomplish with various technologies that we're bringing to bear. So my amendment, again, emphasizes that the space debris actually is reaching a point where collisions with space debris may cause more space debris. And basically what we're asking for is that this be reaffirmed in the authorization bill, that space debris is something that should be a high priority for NASA to be looking at and dealt with.
Does the gentleman yield back his time?
I would yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. I just want to say I support your amendment, appreciate your longstanding interest in the subject, and I hope other members will support it as well. Does anyone wish to be heard on this amendment? If not,
It just makes more sense than the last one.
the ranking member says it makes more sense than the last one, but I'll let we'll take that as a yes. Okay. Okay. If there's no further discussion, all in favor of the Rohrabacher amendment, this is the second amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to, and the gentleman from California is recognized for his third and last amendment.
Yes, buoyed by the fact that I have received such support from the other side of the aisle on my last amendment. Let me note that what we have in I have an amendment at the floor there, and okay. What it is, we are determination, insert a new paragraph, determinations by the administrator or secretary under paragraph D must be publicly disclosed 30 days prior to the acquisition of such space products. What we're talking about, my amendment is talking about, is there's a requirement that whenever the administrator makes a decision as to what type of technologies and what type of supplies are needed and by the space program, that basically we try to do commercial rather than simply leave it a matter of leaving it up to the government and the bureaucracy. Well, there is an exception to that. It allows that permits the administrator to actually, go and decide not to use the commercial alternatives. And it states, in planning to carry out space exploration missions, administrators shall prioritize acquisitions to use in space products provided by the United States and other commercial United States providers. Let me note there is an exception to that provision, and I like the provision. The provision underscores America's fundamental strengths, which is by using the commercial and the private sector, we're able to bring things in a costly manner, actually more costly than just using the government. It creates a marketplace which will bring down the cost of future needs. And anyway, we need to really encourage commercial use and alternatives for our space missions. My amendment comes to place in that exception, which is the NASA administrator or the Secretary of the Air Force can make a determination that the commercial approach is not really right in this specific decision. Well, I think that's fine, but what my amendment does is make certain that there is an accountability if commercial space alternatives are not being used. And it requires that the Secretary or the Administrator and the Secretary of Air Force actually make public why they made that decision. And it's a matter of transparency, basically. And so with that I said, it is clear, however, to me, that we have not worked out the wording of this in a way that's acceptable to everyone. And I appreciate your leadership, Mr. Chairman, and so I'm going to be withdrawing this amendment, which makes this mandate of whenever they're not using commercial, that it actually be explained, be publicly presented. But the idea is a good idea, but I understand there's some objections to specific wording of how it might imply, with an understanding that we'll work together on finding the right wording where both sides of the aisle can agree and that we can all agree. I'd be willing to withdraw my amendment.
Without objection, the amendment's withdrawn, but let me reassure the gentleman from California that, as he suggested, we will continue to work on the language, and I do appreciate the statement and that he made and his interest in the subject. We will now,
And I withdraw my amendment.
without objection, we will now go to another amendment offered by the gentleman from California, by Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment number 27 at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado, amendment number 027.
I ask for unanimous consent to dispense with reading of the
Okay.
amendment.
Without objection, and the gentleman is recognized to explain the amendment, which is being handed out as we speak.
Okay.
The gentleman is recognized on condition that he doesn't hold up a bumper sticker that says Mars 2033. Oh, no, oh, no, oh, no.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I know all of you were worried that I wouldn't hold up my bumper sticker of Mars 2033 today, but I just want to assure you, we still have plenty, and you're welcome to come to my office and get them for your cars. As you've all heard me discuss on numerous occasions, we had testimony a couple years ago detailing how the orbits of Earth and Mars align in the year 2033 to be one of the shortest distances which would allow a human mission to Mars to shave off months off of the trip to that planet. Obviously, by shortening the trip, it reduces the risks our astronauts might face from radiation or who knows what else. Today, we are building the Orion multipurpose crew vehicle and the Space Launch System to carry us on this historic journey, and American industry and our partners around the world are working on the other technologies needed to accomplish this feat. Because this endeavor is not going to be just NASA or just the U.S., we're going to need public-private partnerships and the international community, and all work together to get this done, as the Vice President discussed and described in his speech yesterday in Colorado. The missing piece to this puzzle right now is a requirement for NASA to efficiently plan on how we would take advantage of this opportunity in 2033, if not before, and what we need to be doing on what timelines to get humans to Mars in 2033 or before. Because we've had testimony from SpaceX and some others that it's possible to get our astronauts to Mars even before 2033. My amendment helps fix that problem by giving NASA the task to better incorporate a 2033 mission into their long-term exploration plans. A number of people on this panel or in industry are excited by talk from the administration of going back to moon, but as the Vice President said yesterday, and as we've talked about on this committee, that could just be a stepping stone to our real mission, which ultimately is to get to Mars. I think the amendment that I propose accomplishes that, and I urge support for the amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. I support the amendment and yield to the gentleman from Texas, Chairman Babin.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman from Colorado for his amendment, which I do support. Human exploration of Mars is a very important. It is the big goal. The ultimate goal is to get to Mars by 2033, if not sooner. There are quite a few things that need to be done science-wise and experimentation-wise. Radiation is one of them. A lot of medical problems that we need to address and remedy before we can get astronauts there and safely back. But this amendment provides great direction to NASA towards that ultimate end, and I fully support it. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Is there anyone else who wishes to be, the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I support the gentleman from Colorado's amendment to privatize human exploration to Mars by 2033, while other okay. Prioritize, yeah. While other human exploration endeavors that NASA engages in all have merit, and I do believe that they should contribute toward the goal of going to Mars. Mr. Perlmutter's amendment recognizes a priority and also provides a date for NASA to work toward. I think we've heard this date before, and I encourage all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
And thank you, Ms. Johnson. If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the Perlmutter amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Colorado has the next amendment as well, and he is recognized for the purpose of offering that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have amendment at the desk number 26.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado, amendment number 026.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Colorado is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to offer this and then withdraw it pursuant to the chairman's committing to the fact we can negotiate further as this bill moves along in the process. The bill, or the amendment that I proposed, is to add $8 million to the National Space Grant College and Fellowship Program, or the Space Grant. And it allows, is part of a competitive state and federal partnership through a consortium, all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia. And the program enables students to engage in outreach activities and research projects that prepare them for STEM careers and working with a wide array of industry partners in their communities. Space Grant Consortia are catalysts in each state to help grow the high-tech workforce, and with nearly 1,000 partner institutions, this program promotes aerospace and other NASA and STEM education activities and helps sustain a pipeline of students for innovative high-tech jobs. When I speak with the aerospace industry in Colorado, one of their biggest needs is a passionate and skilled workforce, and the Space Grant helps provide just that. We've held this Space Grant level for a number of years now, even as we've seen the NASA budget grow, and the purpose is to increase that space grant line item. And I would just, before I withdraw it, I would just say to my friends from Texas that just about every single institution in your state, and you have a lot of them, are benefit in some way or another from the Space Grant program. And I didn't know the University of Texas has like a dozen different venues for their institution, and each one of those benefits. So it is it's an excellent program, It leverages both state and federal money. The various aerospace companies benefit by it, but certainly NASA and our space program benefit by it. I will withdraw my amendment, Mr. Chairman, so that we can discuss it greater length as the bill moves through the process.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn, but let me reassure the individual that I think a lot of us support the increase of $8 million. And just so that all members understand why I think this is going to be able to be worked out, the gentleman from Colorado's amendment increases the amount for this fellowship program from 40 to 48 million. Again, I support that. The only difference of opinion we have is whether the entire category is increased from 100 to 108 million. So that's, I suspect, fairly easy to work out between now and the House floor. But we do agree with the additional $8 million. The question is whether to increase the overall account by 8 million. So I think we'll work that out. I appreciate the gentleman withdrawing the amendment. And we have two further amendments. We have a late amendment offered by Mr. Foster and then another amendment offered by Mr. Knight, and I believe that will conclude our markup. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Foster of Illinois, amendment number 093.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. My amendment is designed to encourage NASA to have a hard look at reducing or eliminating the use of high-enriched uranium, otherwise known as weapons-grade uranium, in future missions. As you know, NASA is currently advancing various nuclear reactors for deep space missions, particularly to Mars. One of them is for spacecraft propulsion, which would likely utilize low-enriched, that is, non-weapons-grade uranium. The second is for surface power, which would potentially utilize high-enriched or weapons-grade uranium. High-enriched uranium is one of the most dangerous materials on Earth because of its direct significance for potential use in nuclear weapons and acts of nuclear terrorism, which is why the elimination globally of stockpiles has been a long-standing U.S. policy objective. It is also a material that's very dangerous to handle during normal assembly when you can have criticality incidents. This is appreciated by NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, which is leading the development of the propulsion reactor system utilizing low-enriched uranium. An underappreciated point about this is that the utilization of high-enriched uranium in any space reactor would result in considerable security-related costs and inhibit the participation of commercial and academic partners for development of testing, and establish a very worrisome precedent for other countries to use potentially large quantities of high-enriched uranium in their own space programs. And that is why I'm introducing an amendment today to require that the Space Nuclear Power Report include a cost analysis of the use of high-enriched uranium versus low-enriched uranium in power generation and other space applications, including surface power and in space propulsion. This cost analysis should include the long-term and especially the security-related costs of the high-enriched versus low-enriched uranium. This, I think, will help Congress understand the true costs of these different nuclear power sources. Thank you and for your consideration of this amendment, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it.
Thank you, Mr. Foster. I'll recognize myself to speak on the amendment, and I want to say to the gentleman from Illinois as well as other members of the committee, initially I was going to oppose this amendment because of its being submitted late and being concerned about the process. I know the ranking member and others have made comments about the process on the larger bill, but again, in an effort at comity and bipartisanship today, we're going to overlook the process, and I endorse the gentleman's amendment. Is there anyone else? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin's recognized.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this amendment from Mr. Foster. We have conducted a number of hearings on this very issue, and I support this amendment.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Babin. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there a financial impact on this study, and who would the study actually go to? I'll yield back.
Does the gentleman from Illinois want to respond?
Yeah, well, eventually Congress. I mean, that's the decision we have to make. This is a decision that it will be partly economic and partly due to national security and ultimately global security. You know, it is almost always true that using high-enriched uranium by itself from an engineering point of view will be a less expensive alternative. However, there are real secondary costs, and you have to guard high-enriched uranium really carefully, because a terrorist group that gets their hands on high-enriched uranium can unfortunately quite easily make a nuclear weapon. And so that if you go to a high-enriched uranium facility, at least in the United States, you go through many levels of barbed wire and personal ID and all this. All of those costs will have to be absorbed on any future mission that contemplates using high-enriched uranium for space applications. And I think that costs, if you visit these facilities, there's an impressive number of people that draw their salaries protecting the high-enriched uranium from potential terrorist attack. And when ultimately Congress makes that decision, we should appreciate the secondary costs of that decision. And I think work hard on engineering and solutions using low-enriched uranium.
Mr. Norman, do you yield back the balance of your time? Does that satisfy you? Okay, good. There's the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to voice that I support the gentleman from Illinois' amendment, Dr. Foster. He raised this issue during the hearing with the NASA's acting administrator, and I want to commend you for following through, because this is the next sensible step, and I thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Johnson. If there's no further discussion, the question is on the Foster Amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We will now go to our last amendment to be offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Knight, and he's recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the
And the
desk.
clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5503, offered by Mr. Knight of California.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, very simply, as Mr. Perlmutter always has his his bumper sticker of 2033, I think we should have a new bumper sticker because we are embarking on a new demonstrator. It's the low boom flight demonstrator, which will show that we can fly over land supersonic and not have the great big boom that everybody is accustomed to. So if we're going to do that, and we're going to put people into airliners at some point and go over Mach 1, then we must make sure that we have all the infrastructure and the chase plane availability out at the test facility so that we can get through this program and be flying supersonic at some point. All of us who fly 2 times a week, I'm sure, are very interested in this, and a low boom supersonic demonstrator will be something that we will all Americans will use at some point. So my amendment's very clear. Just make sure that we have the operational and testing infrastructure there and the availability of the chase planes for the low boom supersonic demonstrator. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. We may have a little bit of problem getting that on a bumper sticker because the most succinct description I can come up with is boomless supersonic, but that may not be bad if people know what we're talking about. I support the gentleman's amendment, appreciate his offering that. Is there anyone else who wishes to be heard on the amendment? The gentleman...
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Let me go to Mr. McNerney
Pardon me.
and then to the gentleman from California. Mr. McNerney.
I just wanted to ask the gentleman from California, most often when you see an amendment, it tells you where it goes in the bill. I don't see any references in here. Is that settled in some way?
Yes, I believe that is settled.
It will be in aeronautics title.
It'll go into
It'll be under the aeronautics title,
part of
I'm
the-
told.
of the
Okay,
bill.
we should have, thank you for the clarification. It'll go under the aeronautics title. We'll amend
Yes.
them. Without objection, we'll amend the amendment to make that clear.
Okay, I yield back.
Okay, and who else wanted to be recognized over here? The gentleman from California,
Mr.
Mr.
Note, I'm very pleased that this amendment's been offered. A lot of times we shortchange the aeronautics end of all of this, and this, I think, is really significant in the fact that if America is going to be not just a space power, but the #1 aviation and aeronautics power in the world, and where we're going to sell our future aircraft, we need to have this type of fundamental research that's being done. So I commend my colleague for this, and future aerospace workers throughout the United States will thank him as well. God bless.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. If there's no further discussion, all in favor of the Knight Amendment, say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We are now going to proceed with the recorded vote that was postponed on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. It's number 28. The ayes prevailed by voice vote, but a recorded vote was requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Rohrabacher? Mr. Rohrabacher votes aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Holtgren? Mr. Holtgren votes aye. Mr. Posey? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Weber? Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes aye. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Abraham? Mr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Webster votes yes. Mr. Banks?
That was the toughest vote we had on our side, I hope.
Mr. Banks votes nay. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes nay. Mr. Marshall? Mr. Dunn? Mr. Dunn votes aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes nay. Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman votes nay. Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes aye. Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes aye. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer votes aye. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Hanabusa? Ms. Hanabusa votes aye. Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ votes aye.
Uh-oh, now you're putting me to shame. Before the clerk reports, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, is recognized. How is Mr. Massey recorded?
Mr. Massey is recorded as voting aye. Mr. Massey votes nay.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, votes aye. Are we ready to go? Okay, the clerk will report when she is ready.
Mr. Chairman, 27 members voted aye, 5 members voted nay.
The amendment is, ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 5503 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 5503 to the House as amended. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. A recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Lucas? Aye. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Rohrabacher? Mr. Rohrabacher votes aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Holtgren? Mr. Holtgren votes aye. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes aye. Ms. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Abraham? Mr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. Marshall? Mr. Dunn? Mr. Dunn votes aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman votes aye. Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes nay. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes nay. Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes aye. Ms. Estee? Ms. Estee votes aye. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer votes nay. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen votes nay. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes nay. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes nay. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes nay. Ms. Hanabusa? Ms. Hanabusa votes aye. Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ votes aye.
And the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 26 members voted aye, 7 members voted nay.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 5503 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. Before we adjourn, real quickly, thank members for their participation. We had a great turnout today, and thank those who decided to vote aye in favor of this bipartisan bill, which I hope and expect will increase its prospects of being enacted. So I thank everyone for their participation regardless. If there's no further discussion, that completes our business, and this concludes the Science Committee markup. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned, and Alden is going to come up here and hit the gavel for me. Okay. You can pound it anywhere. Just pound it right here. Okay, real loud. There you go. That is it. Thank you. Good work. Good work.